Give up my Atari?
My television?
How about for this?
You bet your Asteroids.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the arcade here on Player One Start. In our previous trips to the arcades, we pumped a couple of quarters into the Space Invaders and Pac-Man machines, but in this video we're going to be working our way down the line and we're going to be talking about Asteroids. I feel like this is one of the few games that is yet to be faithfully recreated in the home market, and that's because this is the first of the machines we've taken a look at to use vector-based graphics. However, there is one home machine that comes pretty close, and we're going to take a look at that and more in this video. First, I'm going to talk about the history and development of the arcade version of Asteroids, then we'll have a playthrough on the arcade 1-up cabinet, and then we'll talk about the home ports and legacy. So let's sit back, relax, get your tokens and quarters ready, and let's take a look at Asteroids in the arcades. Asteroids was conceived by Lyle Rains and programmed by Ed Logg, with some collaborations with some of Atari's other staff. Logg was impressed with the Atari video computer system, later named the Atari 2600, and he joined Atari's co-op division to work on a game called Dirt Bike, which was never released due to an unsuccessful field test. Paul Mancuso also joined the team for Asteroids as a technician, and engineer Howard Delman contributed to the hardware. Lyle Rains conceived Asteroids as a mixture of Computer Space and Space Invaders. Computer Space is regarded as the first video arcade game ever created. It was modeled after Steve Russell's game Space War that was only available on mainframe computers. Nolan Bushnell wanted to bring this game to the general masses, since many would not have access to a multi-million-dollar mainframe machine. However, the arcade game was a commercial failure, with many noting that the game seemed a bit too complicated for the average person standing at a bar. But by changing this game to be more in line with Space Invaders' addictive gameplay of completion and eliminate all threats, this game was seen as more viable. The unfinished game featured a giant indestructible asteroid, and at one point it is said that Rains asked Logg, "Why don't we have a game where you just shoot rocks and blow them up?" In response, Logg described a similar concept where the player selectively shoots rocks that break into smaller pieces, and that became the concept they would agree on for this game. Now it was time to build the hardware. The first choice was to make this on hardware that would generate vector-based graphics. This design choice is different from sprite-based video games because the graphics in vector-based games are composed of lines drawn on a vector monitor rather than raster graphics drawing sprites. It was decided to go with this method because they felt that the high image quality that you can get on vector graphics at the time would help permit precise aiming. The rest of the hardware is mainly run by an MOS 6502 central processing unit, which was popular in almost every other machine produced in the early 1980s. The arcade cabinet would also include a Quadrascan high-resolution vector graphics processor that was developed by Atari and referred to as an XY display system, as well as the Digital Vector Generator, or DVG. The original design for the Quadrascan came out of Cyan Engineering. That was Atari's off-campus research lab in Grass Valley, California in 1978. This design was previously used for Lunar Lander, and it was modified to have 5 buttons, 13 sound effects, and additional RAM, which would be used to help develop Asteroids the game. Logg would model the player's ship, the 5-button control scheme, and the game's physics after the game Space War. But to improve playability, there were several changes made. The ship was programmed into the hardware and rendered by the monitor, and it was also configured to move with thrust and inertia. The button for hyperspace, which would transport you from one side of the screen to another seemingly at random, would also be moved into a more optimal position, and different drawings of asteroids in various shapes would be incorporated into the game. Logg would copy the idea of a high score table from the game Starfire by Exidy. The flying saucers that would come in every now and again were formulated to be just a little bit different from each other. A steadily decreasing timer shortens the intervals between saucer attacks to keep the player from not shooting asteroids and saucers. A soundtrack similar to that used in Space Invaders will quicken as the game progresses. And that is because the game does not really have a proper sound chip. The engineer of the game actually created a hardware circuit for 13 different sound effects by hand, which were directly wired onto the board. A prototype of Asteroids was well received by Atari staff and engineers, who would wander between labs, passing comments, and stopping to play as they went. And due to the high demand that this game created among Atari staff, a second prototype was soon implemented so that all employees would get a chance to play this game. As in the past with other arcade games, Atari would test this game in arcades, slowly rolling it out in Sacramento, California, but they would also observe players playing the game during focus group sessions at Atari, during which they noted that players used to Space War struggled to maintain a grip on the thrust button and requested a joystick. Players accustomed to Space Invaders noted that they get no break in the game. After making their final modifications to the machine, Atari would officially release the game on November of 1979. When playing Asteroids, the objective of the game is to destroy all the asteroids and saucers in the playfield. The player controls a triangular ship that can rotate left or right, fire shots straight forward, and thrust only in one direction. Once the ship begins moving in a particular direction, it will continue in that direction for a little bit of time, as you will coast for a little bit with each thrust. If you find yourself in any tricky situations, you can simply press the hyperspace button to jump to a random point on the screen. Sometimes, though, this can do more harm than good, as it always seems to me that I spawn on top of or very near an asteroid with no time to move or shoot it. Each level starts off with a few large asteroids drifting around in various directions. However, you'll see that the screen actually wraps onto itself, which is shown when you see objects disappear on the left-hand side of the screen. They will start appearing on the right-hand side of the screen. Same with the top and the bottom. As you shoot asteroids, they will break into smaller pieces that will move faster and faster and are far more difficult to hit. As time goes on, flying saucers will appear periodically on the screen, with the big saucer shooting randomly and poorly, while the smaller one fires frequently at your ship. Once the screen has been cleared of all saucers and asteroids, the whole process starts all over again, starting the next level. Of course, the game increases in difficulty as the number of asteroids increases until you reach a certain score. Typically, you start out with 3 lives, although with the difficulties dip switches enabled, you can have up to 5 ships at the game's start. You can gain extra lives, however, every 10,000 points. You can keep playing as long as you have spare ships available, however the machine will kind of roll over at 99,990 points, which is the maximum score that could be achieved. This version in the arcade 1-up cabinet I do not believe has the lurking exploit, which was an exploit that gamers used to use by sitting at the boundary of a screen so they can take out saucers by aiming across the screen boundary and destroying them on the other side of the screen. Saucers in the original game could not shoot across the screen boundary, so you had very little risk of you getting destroyed by the saucers as long as you didn't have too many small asteroids on screen. After arcade operators began to complain about losing revenue due to this exploit, Atari would end up issuing a patched EEPROM chip to replace in the cabinet to keep players from using this exploit. And while overall I do think that the arcade 1-up does a valiant effort at reproducing this game, it just doesn't seem the same to me when I'm not playing on a vector-based CRT monitor. As it was becoming a tradition with arcade games, eventually there would be a port on the Atari 2600. As Space Invaders set the precedent that if you port a game that people already know from the arcades, they will sell a bunch of copies, Asteroids would be following in that game's footsteps. But as we've seen many times, there would be sacrifices that would have to be made in order to get it to run on less capable hardware, being the Atari 2600. These home ports still look impressive to me just in terms of what they had to do to trick the Atari 2600 into producing graphics that could even resemble what was in the arcade. And it is perhaps for this reason that there was a tradition on box art during this time that you would see these highly detailed graphical illustrations on the front cover and the manual. And I think that was the right choice, because if you just showed this game's graphics on the cover, people might not even know what game this was supposed to be, unless it resembled something they had already seen before in the arcades. But as I stated before, the Atari 2600 wasn't really capable of running vector-based graphics, so they would have to swap out all of the in-game objects with sprites. But that gets even more complicated when you think about it, because the Atari 2600 was really only designed for a two-player system of combat game. You would have a player 1 sprite, a player 2 sprite, a missile sprite, and possibly one more with an enemy. But with Asteroids, you would have many objects moving on screen at a time, and with each moving object requiring its own sprites, this was going to be tricky to program. What you see on the screen is what they ended up pulling off, and even though this may not look impressive by today's standards, I assure you for the Atari 2600, this is a great achievement in what you can do if you properly code for hardware. But as with many video games, it all comes down to how does it play? Well, in all honesty, not too bad. You have to press left and right on your joystick to turn the ship in either direction, you press forward to thrust forward, and you can press back on the joystick to hyperspace to another place on the screen. And of course, the only button on the controller allows you to fire. And that's as simplistic as it needs to be, as this is Asteroids, only presented in a way that the Atari 2600 can handle. If I had any criticism over the game, is that I did find this playthrough to be a bit too easy, or at least easier than the arcade version. And I know in the past, when I've mentioned that about Atari titles seeming to be too easy, people always remind me to check the difficulty switches, but no matter what I set them to, it still seemed to play just about the same. And no, I did not try every variation on the cartridge because there are just too many on there, but I'd never got to the ones that the game's manual states are the easiest. They say games 33 through 66 are very easy versions for young children. But overall, had I got this in 1981 when it first came out for my Atari, I would have been thrilled to have had it, and it probably would have been one of the more frequently played titles on this system. However, if you are unimpressed with this version, or wish the asteroids and ship had more detail on them, I would recommend the Atari 7800 version. The controls and gameplay are nearly identical to the Atari 2600 version, just with better graphics and some revamped sound effects. And overall, I enjoyed this version of the game as well. I don't think you can go wrong with either version. If I had to pick one that seemed more difficult than the other, I would say the Atari 7800 probably provides a bigger challenge. But I will also note on the Atari 7800 version, I enjoyed playing it with this NES-style reproduction controller for the Atari 7800 more than I enjoyed playing it with the joystick. I do know that there is a version for the Atari 8-bit computer systems that were out, however I don't own that system nor the game, so I can't really review it. There was also a version planned for the Atari 5200 that fell through and went unreleased. The last port we're going to look at as a standalone release is the Game Boy version that was released in 1992. But anyway, in this game you do get the classic gameplay of Asteroids in your hand. In this version of the game, you use the directional pad to rotate your ship left and right, as well as thrust by pressing up on the directional pad. However, in this version, you will use the A button to hyperspace into a different location, and B to fire. This game did support the Game Link cable that would allow you to play two-player games in either competition or team play. I think this game plays best on a Super Game Boy because when you're playing it on a regular handheld, for me it's hard to see the asteroids once they get really small. But that could just be me as an adult because my eyes are getting more aged by the day. In the next generations of consoles to follow, it is very common to see Asteroids included as a bundled game in an Atari compilation. One of the earliest examples I was able to find of this was the Midway Presents Arcade Classics Atari Volume 1 compilation. This was released around 1996 or 1997 on the PlayStation 1 and the Sega Saturn. It was also released for the Super Nintendo, and as far as I can tell, this may be the only version of Asteroids you can get on that system. Later it would be re-released as part of Atari's Anniversary Edition. I was able to play it for the first time in 1080i on the Xbox in the Atari Anthology Collection. It has been re-released with some of the Atari mini consoles, and yes, you can even play it on modern systems, with the latest offering being Asteroids Recharged, which is scheduled to be released for the Nintendo Switch and other platforms on December 14th of this year. Asteroids would receive a sequel in the arcades in 1981, titled Asteroids Deluxe. In this version of the game, the on-screen objects are tinted blue, and hyperspace is replaced by a shield that depletes when it's used. The asteroids now rotate, and new killer satellite enemies break into smaller ships that hone in on the player's position. The game is notably more difficult than the original, and the game was made without any involvement from the original game's creator. The game had another sequel in 1982 titled Space Duel that featured colorful geometric shapes and co-op multiplayer gameplay. In 1987, a third official sequel known as Blasteroids would add power-ups, ship morphing, branching levels, bosses, and the ability to dock your ships in multiplayer for added firepower. However, this game would use raster-based graphics instead of vectors. As mentioned before, this game has been released on a plethora of platforms. It was released as Super Asteroids and Missile Command on the Atari Lynx, and that version of Super Asteroids was also included in the 1993 Microsoft Arcade compilation for PC. In 1998, Activision would publish an enhanced version of Asteroids for the Sony PlayStation. It would eventually be released on the Nintendo 64, Microsoft Windows, Game Boy Color, and Macintosh. The game inspired a myriad of unofficial clones, one of them being Quality Software's Asteroids in Space in 1980, being one of the best-selling games for the Apple II, but I think my favorite clone from this time period has to be Mindstorm for the Vectrex. And that is largely due to the fact that the Vectrex uses a vector-based monitor for all of its games. My Vectrex shipped with this game built in, so when I turn it on with no game inserted into the cartridge slot, it automatically boots to Mindstorm. I think I have spent hours just playing this game alone, and I think that's a testament to how well this game was presented on this system. But overall, since its release, Asteroids has proved to be extremely popular. After initially selling over 70,000 units, Atari was forced to ship Asteroids hardware in lunar lander cabinets in order to meet the steadily rising demand. In some areas, arcade operators even installed larger catch boxes to allow more quarters to be inserted than normal because the machines would break down if they couldn't take any more quarters. The home ports on the Atari 2600 was an instant bestseller, and the game's popularity has influenced several other games since, as other game developers have tried to tap into what made Asteroids so addictive to its audience. And what is it that makes us so attracted to Asteroids? Well, maybe it was the fact that in the late 1970s, space culture was on a huge boom. And I think the setting of space and its possibilities have never really left our imagination since that time. But whenever you add in simple game controls with the concept of just fighting for survival, I think that's something that taps into all of us as human beings. Survival is a concept that seems hard-coded into our DNA, and I think how strong that instinct is ingrained into us is shown in just how popular Asteroids has been since its introduction over 40 years ago. With that said, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure you leave it a like on your way out. Also leave a comment below, let me know what your experience has been with the Asteroids game, as well as what classic 80s arcade game you would like me to cover next. But until then, I encourage you all to find your nearest copy of Asteroids and have fun playing. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, if you enjoy the content of this channel, please remember to click on this subscribe button.
You're a starship captain in an asteroid field. Blast away your laser.